Do you think that science and Christianity are incompatible? Well, the Apostle Paul didn't think so. I'll come back to that in a minute. In the first video in this series, you saw how religion has always been tied to science. The second video demonstrated that the Judeo-Christian worldview led to modern science. And in the last video, you saw how the Bible tells us to do science. In this video, you'll see that the greatest Christian evangelist actually used science to point people to God. Paul begins his evangelism to the Gentiles by pointing them to science. In chapter 14 of Acts, Paul is speaking to the people in Lystra who had tried to make him and Barnabas into the gods Hermes and Zeus. Paul, of course, tells them that he and Barnabas are just men. But then he adds, "You should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." Paul then goes on to say that nature can testify to this God. In Acts 14, we find the first recorded evangelistic message to an audience with no background in Judaism. So it's no surprise that Paul doesn't start to talk about the way Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy. Instead, Paul tells them that the natural world is God's testimony of his goodness and his interest in them. In other words, he appeals to natural revelation. The greatest evangelist in history actually begins with science when telling non-Christians who have no background in the church about Jesus. When Paul is in Athens, as recorded in chapter 17 of Acts, early in his speech at the Areopagus, Paul talks about the God who made the world and everything in it. Paul's beginning point here is again with nature, pointing to the created world to show that the Christian God, while having created everything, is actually too great to be worshipped as part of the created world. When we do science, we are looking at the creation, which then can point us to the Creator. Paul explains in Romans 1 why he chooses to begin with science when talking to those with no background in Judaism or Christianity. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. The knowledge of nature can lead to a knowledge of God. Paul, who had met the risen Christ, did not view science as separate and incompatible with Christianity, and in fact, used science to point people to Jesus.